Hello, I'm Michael Levine, and welcome to another edition of Without Notes. Today, our guest is a Hollywood legend, but a legend of a different kind. He is the country's best-known private investigator, Hollywood private investigator, and I thought it would be fascinating to talk to Scott Ross about how his most unusual life has unfolded, working on some of the biggest trials in the last 3 decades. Scott, welcome to Without Notes. You, I think, know the drill because you're a fan of the shows.
That's very true. I watch it frequently.
Thanks.
And sadly, it's been 4 decades, but that's a whole other...
I appreciate the correction. Anyway, let's start with some biographical stuff. Let's get that out of the way. Where were you born, Scott?
Born Lincoln, Nebraska.
Lincoln, Nebraska. Go to high school?
Nope. My parents moved the family to Los Angeles, I think, when I was 3. 3? So I grew up in the Valley, but I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, but I grew up in the Valley.
Brothers, sisters?
1 brother who passed away, and so...
Were you the younger?
I was the younger, yeah.
And the brother passed away. How did he die?
He had cancer. He lived up in Seattle. We had no real relationship. He's not... He was more likely to be a client than a brother.
Got it. With all the implications of that answer. Anyway, so you grow up in Los Angeles in the Valley. You have an older brother and family modestly middle class?
You know, I would say more upper middle class. But again, when you grow up in a neighborhood, you don't pay any attention. Everybody lives the same way.
That was probably more true 40, 50 years ago than it is today.
Probably, but I'm saying, you know, all of the houses were the same. I lived in Northridge. It was a very nice part of Northridge. All of the houses were the same. Everybody had a pool, and, you know, the people across the street, my father had a new Porsche every other year, and the people across the street had their new Mercedes.
No, if your father had a Porsche, that's upper middle class.
Okay.
Now, what did he do for a living?
He sold media time. So if you have a small company and you wanted to buy some commercial airtime, he would go to NBC and he would buy 2 hours of time, you know, 2-hour blocks. So that he would then sell 30 seconds here, 60 seconds there. Every time you saw the commercial, I'm a pepper, you're a pepper, that was one of his biggest clients.
Okay. So you go to school, elementary school, high school in the Valley?
Yes.
Where do you go to high school?
Monroe, class of 74.
Class of 74.
Voted most likely to go to prison.
True?
True. I was a troublemaker. I was a nuisance.
What was underneath your being a troublemaker in high school?
It wasn't trouble per se. I was a mischief maker. You know, if there was a problem at the school, the teachers, the principals would come to me first and say, okay, either you're behind it or you know who was. I was, you know.
You were an instigator.
Yeah, you know, but not to the point of no return. I always wanted to be a police officer. I always knew I wanted to be a cop, so I always sort of maintained that. I pushed the envelope, but I never crossed the line. Okay.
So, a pretty good student?
No.
Not a great
awful,
student.
Horrid. I grew up and I went to private schools until high school because the school no longer had a high school. And so I'm learning things and I don't say anything disparaging, at LA, you know, public school, high school.
You don't need to say anything disparaging
well, I'm saying
about LA public school. LA public school does a very good job at disparaging itself.
Okay, so. Things that I learned in 6th grade at the private school, they're teaching me in 11th and 12th grade at a public school. So no, I was a horrible student. It was, you know, but I got through. And I ended up not being able to go through ceremonies, not because of my grades, but because I was such a nuisance. This was their punishment, to not let me put on a robe and go through ceremonies.
And did you sincerely want to be a police officer?
Yes, I did. Unfortunately, I graduated in 74. The Vietnam War ended in 73. And they were only hiring Vietnam vets. And I kept getting pushed toward the end of the line. And so I was never
eligible,
never able to get to that point. And again, you know, in the late 70s, there was a big women's movement for law enforcement. I went to college I never had a chance to finish.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Valley College and then over to Loyola Marymount. But they didn't have, I had never heard the term student loan, and my parents weren't going to pay for my education. And so I was never able to finish. So that I've always regretted.
So you did not graduate college?
I did not. I did not.
And what do you do 21, 22? What is your first job or two? You wanted to be a police officer, couldn't do that?
Yeah, I actually was very fortunate. I ran into a gentleman who was a retired U.S. Marshal and was dying of leukemia. And as bad as that sounds, and it really was, but you know, you develop a relationship with your clients the same way I have a relationship with people like Tom Mesereau or Harlan Braun, where you become friends.
Tom Mesereau and Harlan Braun are two
attorneys.
Preeminent attorneys.
Yes, that I've had a
country.
very long relationship with. But you develop that relationship, and so this gentleman, his name was Angelo Canzaneri, brought me in to teach me how to take over, meet his friends, and continue his business the way he did. And again, interestingly, he introduced me to a friend of his named Ted Gunderson, who was the special agent in charge of the FBI at that time. He ran the LA office. And when Ted when he ultimately left the Bureau, he needed somebody to sort of get him along, help him along, because Ted was so high up the food chain, he would scribble down a name and throw the piece of paper at somebody. Here, look this guy up. So I became the schmo he started throwing the paper at because he didn't know how to do these things. And because of Ted Gunderson, you know, if you have a federal case and you're dealing with the Bureau and you're Don Ray, you're Harlan Braun, you're any of the big names in the federal jurisdiction in Los Angeles, you have to know who Ted Gunderson is. And so by working with Ted, that's how I met all the big boys.
Big boys are attorneys?
The attorneys. Yeah. Again, you know, like Bob Shapiro, people like Harlan, people like Don Ray, people like Carl Douglas, Johnny Cochran, the attorneys that I worked with years ago. And that's how you meet them.
And you were serving them initially as a researcher?
Well, I was a private investigator. I got my license. So
you got your license as a private investigator in what year?
1983.
1983. You begin a journey.
I started working. Yeah, I started working before that, but I didn't get licensed until 1983.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you start meeting some of these bigger attorneys in 1983, a long time ago. And
yeah.
Were you naturally good at being a private investigator?
I don't know.
What are the skills that, you know, are required to be naturally good at private investigation?
The big one, as far as I'm concerned, common sense.
Common sense.
It's amazing. I had sadly a kid who was convicted of murder, and the one thing he told me is when he was in LA County Jail, he said, "There's nothing common about common sense in here." And that's one thing about the criminal defense system. There's very little connectivity with common sense and the justice system. And so that's the one thing that I felt that I excelled in that enabled me to do my job.
Okay. Now what becomes in 1983 your first big case as a private investigator? Now you're a young man at this point. You're a new private investigator.
Ted was hired, I'd have to do the math. So Bobby Kennedy was shot in '68. So Ted was hired
in Los Angeles.
In Los Angeles. Ted Gunderson was hired by Geraldo Rivera to do the 25th anniversary sort of reinvestigation of the murder of Bobby Kennedy. So at that point, I was working with Ted, and at approximately the same time, Ted had been hired on to do the McMartin preschool case. So I was doing a little bit of McMartin.
Now set the McMartin preschool case for those watching this show throughout the world who don't know of that case. They can certainly Google it.
Right.
But what is the McMartin preschool case?
There was a Bucky and McMartin family that had a child
preschool.
A preschool, yeah.
Yep. In Southern California.
I think they also had an elementary school in Manhattan Beach. And there were allegations of children being sexually assaulted by several members of the staff. The most prominent being the grandson of this woman, McMartin, Raymond Bucky, who was allegedly doing all of these horrific things. And Ted was actually hired by the family. We weren't working on the defense side of it. Ted was brought in by the family to assist the family because the family felt that the sheriff's department wasn't doing their job. Manhattan Beach PD had deferred to the LA County sheriffs because the case was so big.
Right.
And it was a landmark case, not...
Oh, it was a very big case in Southern California.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was as well known nationally, but Southern California was very, very prominent at the time.
Right.
So you found yourself working on that case. That
Correct.
becomes your first large case.
It was the first thing that was getting any real attention at that point. Yeah.
And what do you learn from that experience about your work? What is it that you learn about high-profile cases, which is what your life is going to unfold into, and private investigation? What do you learn?
There's no advantage to being a private investigator in a high-profile case. That's what I learned.
Explain.
It caused that, along with all of the other ones, did more damage than good. Because number one, everything you do is so under a microscope that it creates a lot of pressure. You know, for example, during Jackson,
Michael Jackson.
During Michael Jackson, Tom Mesereau was so... The attorney was so reluctant to, I don't want to say take any chances, but he was so concerned about how things were being done that it made me stop and rethink everything. And the other problem with high-profile cases is people think that you're not interested in handling their little case, that you're too expensive, we can't possibly afford you. So it
cuts both ways.
It does. It makes for a great resume, I guess, but those aren't the cases that are important to me. Those aren't the cases, they are, especially when we win. But then some of them keep coming back. Robert Blake won't go away.
My name is Michael Levine, and thank you so much for watching this episode of Without Notes. Now, if you've enjoyed it, and I hope you have, please like us on Facebook and subscribe to us on YouTube. And most importantly, stay tuned for the next episode.